Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Oakwood Cemetery for another virtual tour. My name is Bruce Miller, and our cinematographer is Robin Simonson, of course. Today, our topic is one that we've found very popular over the years, and that is Raleigh's, or Oakwood, I should say, Oakwood's greatest romances. Familiar to a lot of you who've done our tours, but as I say, always a popular topic. It occurs to us that probably every stone in Oakwood includes within it, if you will, a romantic story. It's just that most of those stories are known to the intimates who were involved in them, and not to us. We're going to do some of the more publicized ones, the ones that are better known. Now, you see behind me, you know we're near the main entrance. And you see behind me the Pullen lot. And Stanhope Pullen, in a way, is an example of what I've been talking about. I must say we know a lot about Stanhope Pullen, and I have never seen any reference whatever to a female companion. He never married. And knowing Pullen, a man who never allowed a photograph to be taken of him, for instance, even had he had a romantic relationship, he'd be the last person on earth to let us know about it. So, again, something is probably simply untold about Stanhope Pullen, and it will have to remain to be it. He seemed to take pleasure in doing business, in his philanthropy, but not in romance, if you will. Now, an exact opposite is one of his neighbors. Robin is panning over. You see the stone of the Hoke family. Robert Hoke, as much of an industrialist, as much of a businessman as Stanhope Pullen was, but Hoke has a great romance that was well known at the time, and we'll tell you more about in just a minute. Robert Hoke, after the Civil War, became a very important industrialist in North Carolina, if you will, involved in all sorts of businesses, insurance, railroads. He established a railroad to Chapel Hill along with the Battle family, worked together. You met the Battles in our last presentation. He ran mines, which had their own railroads, and in fact, here's a bit of trivia for you. One of those mining locomotives that he used became one of the Tweetsie Railroad locomotives. But he had a great romance in addition to his business ventures, and let's go up and meet the object of his affection. All right, we're up now at the Hoke Monument, and this is, as I say, the object of Robert's affection. This is Lydia Van Wyk. Now, in New York, they mispronounced the name Van Wyk, as in the Van Wyck Expressway in New York City. Lydia, born in South Carolina, went to St. Mary's School here in Raleigh, but had, especially through her four older brothers, deep connections with New York City, of all things. In fact, her brother Robert was the mayor of New York City when the five boroughs were unified. Another brother, Augustus, ran for the governorship of New York State against Teddy Roosevelt in 1898 and lost. So she was well connected up there. I think it was the mothers, both Lydia's and Robert's, who engineered their getting together. Because after the Civil War, Robert went to New York and had an audience with Lydia. They met, and it was what I like to call a laughs experience. Love at first sight. There's a story of them coming down a stairway in the Fifth Avenue Hotel where they met, and there's a mirror at the bottom of the stairs. Supposedly Robert turned to Lydia, whom he just met, and said, "Don't we make a handsome couple?" And you could just get the sense that this was it, a very pretty girl with a very important man. They made the rounds of the dances and so forth in the North and the South, and eventually were married and moved here to Raleigh. In fact, they lived initially in Raleigh, just a couple of blocks from where I'm standing right now, the corner of Polk and Person Street. Eventually moved to P Street, to a Baroque-style wonderful mansion, but Lydia found it too far out of town, so they moved closer to town, down to where the Holiday Inn is at Dawson Street. Anyway, a great romance. He was the first of the two to pass away, buried out of the Church of the Good Shepherd. She outlived him and left us wonderful stories of their relationship here in Raleigh. Now, as a footnote to the Hokes, some great romances can be considered great in part because of their results. And this is a remarkable result of the relationship between Robert and Lydia Hoke. Their son, Michael Hoke, went to UNC, captained the football team, but he became a children's osteopath, a pioneering children's osteopath, was known nationwide as Dr. Mike, was featured in a Time magazine article in the 1930s, became a friend of Franklin Roosevelt, who was handicapped himself, and when Roosevelt wasn't at the Warm Springs White House in Georgia, the Hokes would occupy it. And the Shriners eventually picked up on Hoke's work with children and the Shriner hospitals. You know, I think of Dr. Mike every time I see an ad for St. Jude's on television, because it's largely his work that helped to produce those hospitals. Dr. Mike and Robert and Lydia Hoke. All right, we've moved over to from the Pullen section to the Anderson section now, and a story again that if you've been on our tours, you probably know well. I know it's one of Robin's favorite. This is the story of Louise Bunker Haynes. Louise was the daughter of one of the Siamese twins, Chang, and between them, the Siamese twins who retired to Mount Airy in North Carolina in 1839 and married two sisters, the Yates sisters. Between them, they fathered some 21 children. No, put your hands down. This is a G-rated presentation. We don't take any questions. Louise and one brother, Jesse, of the children, were the only two that were born deaf. And that's how they wound up in Raleigh. They came to the deaf school, which used to stand down at McDowell and Jones Street. And they came there for their schooling. And also at the deaf school, while they were there, was one Zacharias Haynes. He was there as a student himself for a while, and afterwards he became an instructor at the deaf school, and that became the basis of his career, in fact. The rolls, the attendance records of the deaf school are at the North Carolina Archives, and this, if my calculations are correct, just about on the day that Louise turned 18, she and Zacharias were married. And they stayed on in Raleigh and lived in Oakwood community, which abuts the cemetery here. Now, Chang and Ang, the twins, died together in 1874, and they left a sizable estate to their children, including Louise. In fact, Louise and Jesse, the two deaf children, were left an extra $500 because of their handicap. So they made out quite well with Chang's estate. And it's about the same time that we see Zacharias take an interest in buying property. And he bought a good deal of property in this section of town, in Oakwood. In fact, those of you who know Oakwood and its environs, you know the Tucker House. Well, the two lots that the Tucker House now sits on were at one point owned by Zacharias Haynes. In fact, they lived on Person Street during their time together in Raleigh when he taught at the deaf school and she was raising their own family, some 10 children. He eventually was reassigned to the new deaf school to help open the new deaf school out in Morganton, North Carolina, and some of the family anyway moved west. And that's where Zacharias died at the turn of the century, in 1900. And Louise came back, and she bought the house that's now on Bloodworth Street, that's now called the Louise Bunker Haynes house, and that's where she spent the rest of her life. She lived a long time after Zacharias, over 30 years. Must have been a very lonely time for her. Their children, as far as I know, none of them grew up with a handicap and made fine contributions of their own to the life of North Carolina. We've moved across the cemetery from Louise Haynes. Louise Bunker Haynes and her family, I think, a story of great local interest, but perhaps the romantic story in Oakwood that is of the broadest interest is that of Berrien Upshaw, or Red Upshaw. He was the great beloved for a time, if you will, of Margaret Mitchell. There's a name you all know, Margaret Mitchell, who wrote Gone with the Wind, published in 1936, long after her relationship with Berrien Upshaw. Margaret was an Atlanta girl. She obviously didn't grow up among plantation aristocracy, but she knew all about that. She'd visited those places. She'd heard the stories, the Civil War lore that we eventually see take life in Gone with the Wind. So it always surprised me that this Southern girl should choose to go to school way up north in Massachusetts, of all places, at Smith College. And of course, I think that helped her with her academic realm. Now, in this story, of course, historically, Berrien becomes the heavy. He takes he emerges not a very admirable person, and to be sure, that's true. However, what's often overlooked is this fact, and that is Margaret Mitchell liked men. She enjoyed the company of men. She enjoyed to be pursued, if you will, by men. So perhaps she's not entirely blameless in this rather unhappy story. In fact, while she was at Smith, she met a young man named Clifford Henry, who was in the military at the time. Clifford Henry, in fact, gave her a ring, which they might have considered an engagement ring, before he was shipped out to go to Europe during World War I, where he died. He died during the war. So when she went back to Atlanta after her time at Smith, she went back sort of on the rebound with a heavy heart. So as she made the rounds of Atlanta dances and deb balls and so forth, whatever they did, it wouldn't be surprising that she found someone like Berrien Upshaw. Now, Berrien also had been born in Atlanta, but his family had moved to Raleigh around 1915, and their house still stands in Cameron Park. But he didn't make very good decisions as a young man. He washed out of the University of Georgia. He washed out of the U.S. Naval Academy not once but twice, so his prospects didn't look very good, which may be one reason why he turned a bootlegger. He ran liquor from the hills of Georgia into Atlanta, and at the same time he was enjoying the Atlanta social seasons, if you will, where he met Margaret Mitchell. And eventually the two of them got married. Again, Margaret, I think, enjoyed the pursuit by Berrien Upshaw, and at the same time there was another man named John Marsh who was interested in Margaret too, and Margaret persuaded John to let Berrien room with him in his apartment. This was much against John's wishes, but nevertheless she was very persuasive. She married Berrien instead of John, and it turned out to be just a terrible marriage. He was an alcoholic, he drank a lot, he beat her, she would emerge with bruises and swollen limbs, and she, in a way, I think, was not particularly unhappy with that because she felt it showed that she was trying to make this marriage work, and it wasn't her fault that it didn't. So eventually, after 2 years, she divorced him. She married John, who had been the best man at her wedding to Berrien. So you see a rather strange threesome here. And they stayed together for 24 years. A good marriage. John was completely different than Barry Upshaw. He helped her write Gone with the Wind. He was her editor, business manager, helped her through that. It's said that there would be no Gone with the Wind if it hadn't been for John Marsh. Berrien eventually went, the last we know of him, he apparently died of a card game, playing a card game in Galveston, Texas. Either jumped or was pushed out of a window. Died that way in 1949, the same year, in fact, that Margaret Mitchell was run down by a car in the streets of Atlanta, and she herself died. Oh, I see. There's a hand. There's a hand. Yes, the elderly lady in the back. Yes, ma'am. What question would you have?
What is Barry Upshaw's role, if any, in Gone with the Wind?
Ah, good question. Yes. Why are we here at all? Remember that his nickname was Red, and Red transferred, if you will, into Rhett Butler. It is thought that given Berrien's character, sort of a ladies' man, certainly, a man, a bootlegger, if you will, a man who loved a good time, he made a perfect model for Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. And I think there's little question that he influenced Margaret Mitchell, along with John Marsh, who was working on it at the same time, in their depiction of Rhett Butler. The question is not did he, the question is just how much. How much of Barry Upshaw, of Red Upshaw, do we see in Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind? I think opinions would vary about that. Thank you for your question, ma'am. We've moved from A section over to the Mordecai section, and this is the grave of someone with a name that many people to this day know. This is Olivia Calper. This is the Calper plot. The patriarch of the family, if you will, was Pulaski Calper, a very respected, wealthy insurance man in Raleigh. Olivia, a pretty girl, you can vouch for that from her portraits, I'll tell you where they are in a minute, was a highly respected young lady. She was the organist at Christ Church downtown. I believe she was the choir mistress there for a time too. Always there every Sunday for the church services, and again made herself well known in town. She met a man named Richard Beverly Rainey. I'm not sure how they first came in contact, but at some point they apparently were pen pals. Their relationship grew, and eventually she and Richard Rainey were married. Richard, a self-made businessman here in Raleigh, involved in many different businesses, from insurance to cotton mills to other things too, cattle. But what he was best known for, he was the owner and operator of the Yarborough House, which is the place to stay in Raleigh down on Fayetteville Street. It used to stand across from the courthouse, burned down in the 1920s, long after Richard had passed away, but nevertheless, a very prominent name, and again, one of those marriages that I think Raleigh must have been very pleased with. Two fine, highly respected people. However, the sad part, this has a tragic note, Olivia died in childbirth 2 years later, and it was crushing for Richard Rainey. He did a bit of traveling, and when he came back to Raleigh, he used a good deal of his funds to build and endow, in fact completely stock, Raleigh's first lending library. 3-story building built on Capitol Square. It's not there now. It's been replaced by the Revenue Building. But there have been 3 Olivia Rainey libraries. After the building itself, the library was transferred down to the 100 block of Fayetteville Street, which is still called the Rainey Building, and eventually out to the county complex out off of Pool Road and the Beltline. Where it's the Olivia Rainey Library, and when you walk in, you see portraits of Olivia. What an attractive girl she was. Richard, several years later, found another romance, a girl who also made a contribution to Raleigh in a very different way. Let's go visit her. All right, we've moved over to the Magnolia Hill section, to the Rainey plot itself. Again, Richard Rainey, bereft at the loss of his first wife, Elizabeth, finds another woman that he eventually marries, and her name was Kate Benson. Now, Kate was actually she grew up in the Oakwood district of homes, which abuts Oakwood Cemetery, and she made a name for herself. The city council hired her to design and prepare a city flag, and that flag was to be a gift to the crew, really, of the USS Raleigh, a cruiser that had fought in the Spanish-American War. So she set to work on that. However, as luck would have it, before she finished her flag, the U.S. Navy decommissioned the Raleigh and took it out of service. So there really was no point that the flag be a donation. Rather, the city council decided simply to keep it, in fact, to make another one, and that became the official city flag, which it still is today. Anyway, Richard married Kate and built her a fine home on Capitol Square in what's now the parking lot next to First Baptist Church. And they raised 3 children there. He passed away in 1909. She lived a long life after that. And by coincidence anyway, Richard Beverly Rainey Jr. became an osteopathic surgeon at UNC, following in the footsteps, if you will, of Dr. Mike. Maybe there's something in the Raleigh water that causes parents to produce osteopaths. But anyway, made certainly a meaningful contribution to young people's health. The Raineys. We're in the Tucker section now, and we thought we'd make a quick stop here. You remember at the very beginning of this episode, if you will, I mentioned that probably every stone out here carries within it a great romance. At least to the people involved, it was certainly a great romance, or romances. We won't know, we may never know. But some stones, I think, like to make that aspect of one's life more obvious than others. And we have a sample here. This is a stone by Mr. Adams. He had a machine business downtown, as I recall. And you see on this stone, he died in 1875, and you see the symbol. This is more up Robin's alley than mine, but the symbol of the hands clasped. One is a female hand, and you can tell that because it's got this lacy cuff. The other, a gentleman's hand, which are much more severe cuff, if you will, male and female, along with an Oddfellow symbol here, the 3 rings. But the main part of the stone is the apparent affection between a husband and wife, as shown in the clasped hands. So here, I suspect, a great romance. Now, just as a footnote to that, remember this stone with all of its, if you will, lavishness, though it's very hard to read now. Now, the wife, Mrs. Adams, died 5 years later, and someone arranged her stone. You see, not like the original stone, much plainer. In fact, the only bit of information it has on here, besides her dates, was that she was born in Scotland. So, very plain stone, but I think it was the husband's stone earlier which spoke for both of them. A great romance. We just finished showing you a symbol that you often see on gravestones of affection between generally husband and wife, a great romance in its own way. And here's another one that's very common on stones from the past as well as in the present. This particular heart is on a stone that those of you who have come to Oakwood often in the past will recognize. You recognize where it is. This will conclude this episode of Full of Life, but we'll begin with this particular stone, with this particular romance on Greatest Romances #2, our next episode. We hope you tune in. Thank you very much.